Hi, everybody. It's Sunday night, so I thought I'd come and say a quick word to my wonderful American literature students. It will really be a quick word, but I did want to just clarify a couple of things and modify a couple of things as we move into the last weeks of the semester. I have been completely swamped for the last 3 days, and I will be for the next 2 days, grading papers coming from my English 112 classes, I should say. And so forgive my brief introduction to the coming week. That does not mean in any sense that you should hesitate to send me questions or raise concerns if you have them. I'm just pressed to the limit at the moment. But here we go, right? We're talking about Whitman this week. We just finished talking about Emerson. I was very interested to read your comments on Emerson. Emerson is difficult, and many of you had some interesting things to say, sometimes not so much about Emerson, but things that Emerson provoked you to think about in terms of your own education and your own thinking about poetry and what poetry is. Of course, the reason we're doing Whitman now is that Whitman was very, very much influenced by Emerson. And if you look at some of the supplementary materials on the Whitman site, you'll see that he actually kind of used Emerson a little bit. He wrote to Emerson, sent him a copy of Leaves of Grass, and Emerson sent Whitman a private letter in response, which Whitman, being Whitman, then published Emerson's private letter praising his work. But that incident aside, Whitman takes very seriously the proposals that Emerson sets out for the poet, and I think that you will find that in your reading of both the preface, Whitman's preface to Leaves of Grass, and in the title, not the title poem, but the opening poem of that collection called Song of Myself. Now, a couple of words of wisdom. First of all, the preface is like a poem, right? It's prose, but you'll see when you read it that the cadences of that prose are actually very, very poetic. And one of the things I'd like you to think about is what is Whitman doing with genre, right? And what is Emerson doing with it? Emerson has just told us in The Poet that it's not meters, right, that make a poem, but a meter-making argument. And so a poem doesn't necessarily have to be something, right, that you can scan. It has to have a meter-making argument. And so one of the things that you might want to think about as you read Whitman's preface to Leaves of Grass is this a meter-making argument? And when we think about poetry, how does work by Emerson and Whitman, even work now more than 100 years old, how does that expand our understanding of what poetry is? I think it expands it a great deal. The next thing is that it's a long preface, right? And when you read Whitman, try not to focus on every single word, right? When you're reading Whitman, you're really reading for the cadence. The unit for Whitman is the line, right? It's more like the sentence and the line, not the word, right? When we get to Emily Dickinson, right, you might be more inclined to think about the word, right, as the unit of composition. But with Whitman, it's more the line. And so keep going, right? Even if you don't try to read it as if you're going to make sense of every last thing he says, read it cumulatively, right? And that will, I think, not only help you get through it, right, but it will help you to understand in a visceral, in an almost somatic way, what Whitman is doing. Okay, but then I want your main focus to be on Whitman's Song of Myself. And I've given you a link to the 1855 edition, and that might not mean anything to you, but Whitman revised the Song of Myself numerous times for the numerous editions of Leaves of Grass. And when he did the revisions, he changed the structure somewhat of that poem. I still think, and many Whitman scholars would agree with me, that the 1855 version is the finest, and certainly the most fluent. And so that's the one I've given you. One thing that makes that edition of the poem a little bit more difficult, though, is that there are no section dividers. Right? In some of the later, or in all of the later editions of the poem, Whitman added section dividers, so you can say, look at section 33 or look at section 10, whereas in the 1855, there's nothing. It's just one very, very long poem. That said, I want you to find passages in that poem that particularly interest you, and think about how Whitman is putting this long poem together. Right? How does it work? What does it mean when we talk about organic verse, right, as opposed to metered verse? What does that involve? Because even if you're talking about free verse, right, free verse or kind of organic verse, as Robert Frost said, free verse is never free. Right? There is something structuring that work. It's just that you have to find what those structural principles are. If we have a sonnet, right, we know what the structural principles of a sonnet are. We know a sonnet has 14 lines. We know it has a particular rhyme scheme. We know where to expect the turns in the verse. Right? When you look at Whitman's Song of Myself, you're not going to get that kind of guidance because it's not a meter. It's not in meter exactly. It's in blank verse sometimes, but it's different. Right? We have to find where the turns are. Right? We have to find how the poem falls together. And there are many ways in which it does. Right? So look for the underlying structural principles. And look also at what those structural principles have to do with what Whitman is saying. Right? One thing that's so important in poetry, and no less in free verse than in metered verse, right, is that form and content go together. Right? One of the reasons that Whitman chooses this form, right, chooses this organic form, is because he's saying something about the nature of democracy. Right? So he has there's a political idea in this poem, but he's also saying something about the nature of thought. Right? There's many, many things going on in this incredible poem. I would ask you, if you decide to do a response for this on Song of Myself, I would suggest focusing on one of the two discussion questions that I composed for this week, and I'll tell you which ones they are. They're 3 and 4. And 3 says, consider the tension in Song of Myself between the poet's desire for fusion and his counter-desire for individual existence. Identify and comment on passages exemplifying these opposing desires. I think you'll feel what I mean by this question when you read the poem, but there are some very particular notes about it in my lectures. So again, right, there's a kind of tension in Song of Myself. It's a tension between Whitman's desire to merge with everything that he sees around him, bodies, events, situations, and then a counter-desire, right, to assert a kind of individual existence. I think if we had to balance those two things or put those two tensions on a scale, right, the fusion part of the scale would go down, right, that there is more of a sense in Song of Myself of this desire to fuse than of a desire to extricate oneself from this merging and declare a kind of individual existence. But both of those things are there. Look for them and analyze them and think about them. The second question is, number 4, is Whitman takes on many different identities in Song of Myself. Which of these identities is most compelling to you and why? Not all these identities are nice identities. Right? Whitman will take on the identity of a suicide. He puts himself he puts himself into the body of a slave. Right? There are many, many identities that he takes on, cultural identities, that are extremely important to the 19th century, and some of them absolutely devastating. Why does he do it? Right? And what can we learn from his appropriation, in a sense, of these identities? Which ones do you believe in? Right? Which ones maybe don't you believe in? But why did he feel, right, this need to appropriate those particular identities? Okay, so those are big questions. Sorry. Those are big questions to think about, and good questions. And I hope if Whitman is of interest to you, the Whitman of Drum Taps was of interest to you, I think you'll find the Whitman of Song of Myself and the Whitman of the Preface to Leaves of Grass interesting as well. However, I know that we are really getting down to the end of the semester, and that you are, as I am, very, very much pressed for time. So as I went back and looked over the work we've done so far, I saw that we've, of course, already talked once about Whitman, right, in Drum Taps. We have another Whitman week this week, and then the next 2 weeks will be devoted to Emily Dickinson and also our Thanksgiving holiday. So my proposal is this, and for those of you who are listening diligently to the videos, you will hear it. If you've already written on Whitman's Drum Taps, and you don't plan to use a Whitman entry on Song of Myself in your final portfolio, you don't need to send in a post for this week. The same thing is going to apply to Dickinson, right? Since we're spending 2 weeks on Dickinson rather than just 1, even though it's really more like 1.5 because of the Thanksgiving break. But if, since we have those 2 weeks, you will only be required to do 1 post on Dickinson, not 2. So instead of the 14 posts originally assigned, there will be 12, and I will just adjust for that in the grading. So if you have done 12, right, you're just fine. So 1 Whitman post, 1 Dickinson post. The only change to that would be that if you really do want to write about Whitman's Song of Myself in your final portfolio, then obviously you want to complete this post anyway. But otherwise, just choose 1 Whitman post and 1 Dickinson post to work on. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. I will try to put these little instructions in a news form as well, so that it's a little bit clearer. And I wish you a good week, a wonderful week with Whitman. Song of Myself is an extraordinary poem, and the older I get, the more compelling I find Whitman. Whitman's cultural politics, and Whitman's verse. He was an extraordinary force in the 19th century, and he's an extraordinary force, I believe, in our own. And when you're reading Song of Myself, please pay very close attention to the final words of that poem and think about what they might mean. All right. I look forward to some responses on Whitman's Song of Myself in the preface. And please don't hesitate to contact me if you have questions about your final portfolios or anything else. Thanks so much, and have a great week.